art is emotion. Therefore, the use of film, I say, putting it together and making it have an effect on an audience is, I think, the main function of film. Certainly, if you take dialogue in a film, truly you are only borrowing from the theater, which is what, as I've often said, most pictures you see are photographs of people talking.
Telescope. Brought to you by General Motors of Canada, makers of Canada's most popular cars and trucks, and Frigidaire appliances.
Tonight's Telescope, quite frankly, is an occasion for photographs of people talking. Happily, however, the man who does most of the talking is a man who long ago learned virtually everything there is to know about making motion pictures, silent and talking, and totally terrifying. In place of the introduction Mr. Alfred Hitchcock does not need, here's this message. Mr. Hitchcock, most Anglo-American film critics have always thought of you principally as an entertainer. For the French, however, you're considered a Catholic moralist. Do you think of your recent films as melodramas and thrillers, or as fables and even allegories?
Well, if you look at it from the point of view of melodrama, we know traditionally that that right must win over wrong. In other words, evil must lose.
Yes.
So that you could apply that to the basic melodrama, or you could apply it to, how should we say, a religious precept.
And you've said that you're more interested in the technique of storytelling by means of film than in the content of the film itself.
That's true.
Could you explain that a little more?
Yes, I can clarify it. Please don't think me presumptuous if I give you, say, the analogy of, say, a painter who paints a tree, a landscape, or even a bowl of fruit. I'm sure that the painter is not a bit interested in the apples for themselves alone, but in the technique of his work, which stimulates the emotion of the viewer of his picture. After all art is experience. People look at an abstract and say, I hate it. Well, the mere fact that they're using the word hate means that they're going through an experience, you see, and or they like it. Therefore, if you apply these principles to film, as I see it, it is not the pure manner of the content. In other words, it's not the story. It's what you do with it.
Not what, but how.
How. And therefore, I find that with many people, they look at a film and they look at its content only and never seem to study, I'm talking about the critical faculty, what was there in the film to make an audience go through these various emotions that you put them through, especially in my field, which is thrill or suspense or what have you. Sometimes one can almost say that the man who builds a roller coaster is an artist, because the grades and dives that he puts into it create the crudest and broadest emotions in the rider.
Well, let's go back down the years to the silent films of the early 20s. Since you were born in 1899, that period finds you in your early 20s also. Were you particularly interested in films before you actually became involved with them?
Yes, deeply.
They'd been a passion from your boyhood?
Oh, no question.
Well, As a writer and designer of titles for silent films, which was your first job in the film world, did you hope to become a director one day, or did that happen by chance?
Happened by chance. My earliest job, after being in the editorial department, designing the titles, was being assistant director, and then I practiced my hand at writing a script. I did it on my own. I took a story, a novel, and eventually a job came up where I was going to be the assistant director, and they said, well, we've got to find somebody to write a script. Who's going to do the script? So I said, I'll do it. They read it and were impressed, and then I got the job. I was 23 then. And then my friend, who was going to be the art director on the same picture, found he couldn't come on this particular picture. It was a big, important picture. It wasn't a small picture. I said, I'll do the art direction, design the sets and so forth, which I did. And therefore, for about 2 or 3 years after that, I carried out the same routine. And then finally, I believe, I'm not sure, but I was told that the director of all these pictures was very jealous because I was getting credit for all this amount of work, and then he said he didn't want me anymore. So the producer said, would I like to direct? And I said, well, it never occurred to me. I was very happy doing what I was doing.
What was the first film you yourself chose to do?
My first choice was The Lodger. This is a book by Mrs. Belloc Lowndes about Jack the Ripper. The Lodger actually was a story in almost one interior. It was the landlady asking herself the question, is the man who is my lodger Jack the Ripper or not?
And I remember in that film one of your first uses of staircases for dramatic effect, the lodger's hand coming down the staircase.
Well, you see, those were substitutes for sound. Today we wouldn't do that. For example, have I got time to describe you how the opening was worked?
Yes, indeed. That's why we're here.
I took the first 10 minutes of the film to show a piece of news and a body being dragged out of the River Thames, and how the reporter picked up the information, got on the phone, and then I showed what happened to that piece of news in all forms: broadcasting, wire service, scintillating running signs, the newspaper office, and so forth. But each time I added a piece of information about Jack the Ripper. He only did it on Tuesday, only fair-haired girls. Then I followed one blonde home to her house, and down in the basement, they're talking about it. And the lights begin to go down, slowly and slowly. And suddenly Mother says, Dad, put a shilling in the meter, the gas is going down. So Dad goes with a shilling to put in the meter. By this time, the place is in darkness, and there's a rat-tat-tat at the front door. Mother goes up to open the door, and she opens it, and Dad puts a shilling in the meter. You can imagine how the thing was quickly cross-cut. As the door opened, the gas came up. And there was a man standing with a cloak and a black bag, and obviously the Ripper standing there. And then later on in the film, I showed how he paced up and down the room. And I had the faces of the people below looking up to the ceiling of this agitated man. And I dissolved the ceiling away. I had a glass floor made.
Yes, I remember that shot.
Saw his feet going up and down.
His feet.
Then when he went out at night, you saw, as you described, the well of the 4 flights of stairs and only the hand going down. Well, today we would do sound. These were the resources one had to use as a substitute for sound.
Visual substitutes
for the sound in the silent picture days.
And The Lodger was the first film, wasn't it, in which you made a personal appearance?
It was in The Lodger, yes.
And that was simply because there wasn't an actor available at the time?
Yes, oh yes. We used to be able to hop in and do a bit if necessary.
Well, after The Lodger, was there then a consistency of personal appearances?
Well, the first big appearance again occurred in Blackmail.
And since Blackmail in 1929, which was the first film with sound that you directed, audiences have enjoyed seeing you pop up briefly and unexpectedly somewhere in all your films. Except for Marnie, the current Hitchcock production, the most recent example was in The Birds. Mr. Hitchcock, most critics have always considered Shadow of a Doubt, which you made in 1943, as your finest film.
Me too.
That is your opinion of it still?
Oh, no question.
In Shadow of a Doubt, of course, as in all Hitchcock films, your use of the camera has always been unique. The whole technical side of filmmaking, especially editing, has been a principal concern of yours. Would you be good enough to explain some of the basic methods in the cinematic approach to storytelling?
Well, you have two kinds of what we might call montage. I think we call it cutting. It isn't exactly that. Cutting implies severing something. It really should be called assembly. Mosaic is assembling something to create a whole. Montage means the assembly of pieces of film which, moved in rapid succession before the eye, create an idea. Of course, the most elementary form is the juxtaposition of imagery in various sizes. You know, a lot of people think that cutting is, or we'll say montage or assembly, is taking a man from one place to another and jumping into a close-up of him, which Griffith invented, it's true. But to me it goes much deeper. And as I say, the picture Psycho contained quite an amount of cinematic approach to this, to its basic content. In the first place, we had in it the murder of a woman in a shower, of a nude woman. Now, as you know, you could not take the camera and just show a nude woman being stabbed to death. It had to be done impressionistically. So it was done with little pieces of film. The head, the feet, the hand, the parts of the torso.
Shadow on the curtain.
Everything, you see, was used. The shower itself. I think in that scene there were 78 pieces of film in about 45 seconds. Now that's one kind. Now we'll take another kind, which I would prefer to call, say, the orchestration. Loud notes, soft notes, and so forth. The second murder in Psycho was treated quite differently. It showed a detective coming up the stairs, the audience already aware that a monster was around. So they were apprehensive for him, but they didn't know when it was going to happen. So I have this man mounting the stairs in what we would call a medium shot, a waist shot. And he gets to the top of the stairs. Then I take the camera and put it very, very high, way, way high, above the ceiling almost, as though we're looking down on the whole thing. And a little figure runs out with a raised knife. And the hand goes up with the knife into the air and starts to bring it down. Now remember, these are two tiny figures. Then the next cut is a big head of the man as the knife goes across his face. Now, this is size of image put together to create shock. In other words, if it were music, it would be tremolos on the violin and suddenly a brass instrument, which is the big close-up. And from that he fell and went back. So there's an illustration of using the size of the image to create shock, or whatever you will. Now the third way is what one might call pure cinematics, the assembly of film, and how it can be changed to create a different idea. Now we have a close-up. Let me show what he sees. Let's assume he saw a woman holding a baby in her arms. Now we cut back to his reaction to what he sees, and he smiles. Now what is he as a character? He's a kindly man. He's sympathetic. Now, let's take the middle piece of film away, the woman with the child, but leave his two pieces of film as they were. Now we'll put in a piece of film of a girl in a bikini. He looks, girl in a bikini, he smiles. What is he now? The dirty old man. He's no longer the benign gentleman who loves babies. That's the difference. That's what film can do for you.
Or you for it, as it were. Now, let's talk about some of the writers who've worked with you on the screenplays of your films. Among them, Thornton Wilder, Arthur Lawrence, Dorothy Parker, Robert Sherwood, Maxwell Anderson. Which kind of writer do you find best suited for creating a film script, the playwright or the novelist?
I would say the playwright rather than the novelist is more important, because you need scenes, playing scenes. There's people who are from the theater who can write playing scenes for you.
They've learned that compression and essential
compression
flow
is very, 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 very important. After all, who was it once said that drama is life with the dull bits cut out? So compression and economy belongs to the playwright. It doesn't belong to the novelist. You know, he can go on for 1,000 pages.
Quite so. Well, let us go on to further pictorial aspects of filmmaking. You first used color in Rope, I believe, and 10 of the 15 films you've made since then have been in color, though many producers seem to believe that a thriller should always be filmed in black and white. Which do you prefer?
I prefer color because there's plenty to dramatize in the color. By not using color until you need it dramatically.
In the same way, music is often valuable.
Sure, I think music's very good, especially when it's needed for silence.
The absence of it.
Yes, of course.
Obviously, you think very highly of the work of Bernard Herrmann.
I certainly do.
He's been involved as composer and conductor of the music in so many of your recent films. How do you and Mr. Herrmann go about examining the contribution of music to a film?
Well, I don't know. As far as I'm concerned, he does as he likes.
I'm brought in at the very beginning of the idea of the film. And by the time it has gone through all its stages of being written and rewritten and the final process of photographing it, I'm so much part of the whole thing that we've all begun to think one way.
But I've always found with musicians that you're in their hands anyway. What can you do? So very often I've been asked, not necessarily by Mr. Herrmann, but other musicians, they say, come down, I want you to know what you think of this. And you go down and you say, well, I don't care. If I say, well, we can't change it, it's all scored. So the next time you take good care to say, well, can you play me some and let me hear some of it before you go to the expense of an orchestra? Oh, no, you can't play it on a piano. It's not possible. So that there is no way to find out. So you are in the hands of a musician.
Well, Psycho is a very good example of the, if I might put it, the freedom with which Hitch thinks about music. Originally, the plan was, in our discussions, not to have any music over any of the murder scenes. However, I differed with Hitch about this and felt that music was needed. And then I suggested to Hitch that I would like to show him the same scenes with music. Hitch has his own world of film, and he's created characters and places and stories for it, very much in the way Dickens did. It's not a question of whether it is a real world or an actual world, but it's a world that has been imagined and realized. Dickens was able to do it through the page, and Hitch does it through this film. And although many of the stories that he has told are stories of our time, I believe the way of presentation and the motivating psychology is essentially of the period of Dickens and the great Victorian writers. Psycho is very much, for example, like a Wilkie Collins story. I think this is part of Hitch's great heritage as an Englishman, and one that he's been able to transmute and to carry forward in the world of the cinema.
Next week, part 2 of Telescope's talk with Hitchcock. Among other diversions, the master of mayhem will introduce us to Marnie, which is the title of his current feature film, starring Tippi Hedren and Sean Connery.
Marnie is the story of a girl who is a compulsive thief. And she does various jobs and then runs up against a man who falls for her, knows she's a thief, and engages her in his company, and he courts her. But he's a little disturbed when he finds out that she's robbed him as well. It's real sort of late Victorian Edwardian type of hero, you know. Very strong, very meaty. It's a very intriguing yarn.
Fletcher Markle for Telescope.
Telescope has been brought to you by General Motors of Canada, makers of Canada's most popular cars and trucks, and Frigidaire appliances.
Go on. We've got more. We've got to go much more down there. We're cutting. That's out of the picture. All that's out of the picture.
Do you want to start from scratch?
No, no.
T-shirt, just go with this. Put another T-shirt.
Put another T-shirt.
Put another T-shirt on.
But you must go the lower part.
We want to get rid of those folds.
Lad, keep going.
Along with his activities as a producer-director of theatrical films, Alfred Hitchcock is the host and impresario of a long-run television series. In addition to a monthly mystery magazine bearing his name, he also edits an expanding shelf of best-selling anthologies of suspense stories, published in half a dozen languages. During one of our recent meetings in his Hollywood office, I asked him how he managed to live so many lives. With all these enterprises demanding attention, Mr. Hitchcock, how do you find time for such projects as the monograph you've just completed on the motion picture for the Encyclopedia Britannica?
Well, there's always Saturday and Sunday.
Telescope. Brought to you by General Motors of Canada, makers of Canada's most popular cars and trucks, and Frigidaire appliances.
Continuing our talk with Alfred Hitchcock tonight, we're going to find out why such labels as the Merchant of Menace, the Pied Piper of Peril, and the Panjandrum of Panic have been pinned on his conservative lapel. Also, it pleases us to promise you'll be hearing the Hitchcock theory about the theater in the year 3000. A startling revelation from the man whose successful manipulation of evil in the movies would seem to indicate that evil is the root of all money. Mr. Hitchcock, there's been a lot of comment over the years about the social impact of films on audiences, their influence for good or evil. Do you think that films have much real influence, or is it merely a momentary thing?
I think in the main it's a momentary thing. I suppose if one stood outside any movie house, most of the faces are either giggling or smiling, even when they come out of a horror picture. You don't see them coming out pondering deeply. I think the immediate reaction to a film is quite different from a later reaction. I'm sure that there are certain things in films which affect fashions. You know, the famous occasion when Clark Gable left a T-shirt off or something, and the sales fell off enormous.
It happened one night.
That's
that was,
right, yeah.
So you don't really feel that sociologists have much of a foundation for saying that films that record the criminal impulse or television shows that concentrate on crime have a lasting influence on the viewer?
I would say it had an influence on sick minds, but not on healthy minds. It reminds me of when I made Psycho. A man was arrested in Los Angeles for murdering 3 women. And he is alleged to have said that he murdered the 3rd woman after seeing Psycho. So I was called by the newspapers for a comment. And my only question was, what film did he see before he murdered the 2nd woman? And perhaps before he murdered the 1st woman, maybe he'd just drunk a glass of milk.
Fair enough.
And the little boy came up to me once in the street, about a 7-year-old boy, and said, Mr. Hitchcock, in that murder scene in Psycho, what did you use for blood? Chicken blood? I said, no, chocolate sauce. Okay, and he went on his way. Well, see, the operative phrase was, what did you use for blood? He didn't believe it.
And yet, even though audiences are increasingly familiar with the machinery of filmmaking, special effects, process photography, and so forth, they're still completely entranced by the finished film.
Oh, I'm sure they are. I'm sure they are.
Well, you often employ technical stunts in your films that audiences never notice.
It's like in Marnie, you know. Marnie is
This is the new film.
New film, where the girl is a compulsive thief. But after every job she does, she always goes down to a farm in Maryland and I suppose using some of the proceeds, goes riding on a horse. Loved to ride on a horse. In the open air, let her hair blow free, almost as though she were cleansing herself of the crime she's just committed.
And though most of those riding sequences were shot on location, it was still necessary to use a rear projection screen on a soundstage to capture certain details of action and reaction.
That's true.
But let's turn now to the subject of actors. I imagine that you sometimes have problems when you're working with an important star in that he or she mustn't turn out to be the real villain of a story. Audiences don't like that sort of thing.
They won't be the villain for their own sake of their own career. And very often, after all, the idol which you put up there must do no wrong.
Yes. I was thinking of the ending of Suspicion.
Yes, well, that was a complete mistake, you see, to make that story with Cary Grant. Unless you could have a cynical ending. Suspicion deals with the subject of a man whose wife thinks he's a murderer.
Yes.
And finally, even to the extent when he brings her up a glass of milk at the end of the picture, she knows he's going to murder her. Well, in our film, we had to make it that it was an innocuous glass of milk. In truth, the ending of the picture should be, yes, this is it, and this is the murder. And I had an idea for an ending that she knows of all this. She writes a letter to her mother and says, "Dear mother, I'm in terrible straits. I want to die. He's going to kill me, but I love him so much I can't live anymore. But I do think society should be protected from him." And she seals the letter and leaves it beside the bed. When he brings up the fatal glass of milk, she said, "Would you mind mailing that for me, dear?" She drinks the milk, literally commits suicide. And you fade out on her death. And you have one shot, a cheerful whistling Cary Grant popping a letter into the mailbox. That's the way I wanted to end the picture.
Well, speaking of endings, let's turn now to the subject of the birds, one of your recent pictures with a somewhat controversial ending. Did you intend the birds to be a fantasy?
Well, I think most of the films I make are fantasies. They're not slices of life. They're all larger than life. North by Northwest was a nightmare. If I'd had my own way and was not considering the global audience, I would have jumped that man all over America, like a nightmare, from one dreadful experience to another. But I had to smooth it out for audiences. So that was a real fantasy. Sure, The Birds was a fantasy.
But it had a tremendous air of reality to it, nevertheless.
So there were nightmares.
What was it that appealed to you in the Daphne du Maurier short story on which the film was based?
Oh, I think it was an example of an extremely unusual occurrence. I think the unusual nature of the occurrence appealed to me.
And how did you go about casting a writer for the screenplay? I presume you cast writers to work with you as you would cast actors.
I remember one writer I had in, I think he was an English writer, who said to me, "Well, I see this film done only in one way. You should never see a bird."
Once you had decided against the approach of never seeing a bird, at what point did you begin to consider the technical problems involved in putting the story on film?
Never dared face them at the outset, otherwise the film would never have been made. We had to play it by ear.
Well, at what stage did you finally have to turn your attention to technical considerations?
Oh, at the beginning of the picture, but they were so involved that we were well on the way in the shooting that we had to face up to these enormous technical problems. In the film as a whole, there were about 28,000 birds used, 3,000 of them trained, 30 of them specials, and about 4 leading actors. Corvus was a very, very good actor, one of the Ravens. When he had to peck someone, he never missed a take. He was on cue every time. In fact, in some of the scenes where we had the crows chasing children down the schoolhouse street, they were superimposed on the original film. So they were shot against a plain background in the studio, from one perch to another across the screen. And they got so used to the commands that they were anticipating them. When the cameraman said roll them, they flew before they should have done. So they had to end up by not giving any verbal commands at all. They were very smart.
Well, the birds may have been a fantasy, but it had a tremendous air of reality to it, nevertheless.
Well, don't you see, a nightmare is very vivid. And I've always taken great care to be accurate in all detail, no matter how fantastic the situation might be. Now, people have said to me, and this is where the accuracy bothers me, people say to me, Mr. Hitchcock, why don't you make more costume pictures? I say for a very simple reason. Nobody in a costume picture ever goes to the toilet. Now that means that it's not possible to get any detail into it, just as much as people say, why don't you make a Western? And my answer is, well, I don't know how much a loaf of bread costs in a Western. I've never seen anybody buying chaps in a Western, or being measured, or buying a 10-gallon hat. And this is sometimes where the drama comes from for me.
A moment of melodrama happening suddenly in a commonplace setting.
And that is the most important moment, when the man is buying a hat in the store in Bond Street, when the gun is thrust into his ribs. You see, it's the juxtaposition of the norm, of the accurate average, against the fantasy. And it is fantasy.
The ordinary and the extraordinary.
Yes, of course.
Side by each.
Well, that's the point. That's what makes the thing interesting.
But tell us, Mr. Hitchcock, how do you envision the theater of the future?
I see the possibility, maybe in the year 3000 or something, that people go to be entertained, if entertainment is still needed then, and they go into a big darkened auditorium, and they are mass hypnotized. And instead of identifying themselves with somebody on the screen, they are that person. And when they buy their ticket, they choose which character they want to be. And under hypnotism, mass hypnotism, they go through the story, and it's injected into them by some kind of telepathy, and they suffer the agonies and so forth, or enjoy the romance with a woman or something, and then the lights go up and it's all over.
Would the...
Maybe it's Hitchcock's new conception of how to dispense with actors. Or because what have I said once on one occasion? Walt Disney has the right answer where actors are concerned. If he doesn't like them, he tears them up.
Well, supposing mass hypnotism did come as a logical or illogical progression in entertainment, would you be interested in it as a director?
Yes, you'd have to have a director. You'd have to have a writer, because you'd have to write the story. The director would, I suppose, be the hypnotist, because it would be his manner of directing the minds of these somnolent people into the right direction and approach. The whole idea is very ephemeral and very hard to...
I'm not so sure about that. I have a very strong feeling that that's the kind of thing you're doing today.
I suppose it is, in a way. Yes, it is.
Now, about television. What was your reason for becoming involved in television in 1955?
Well, I think that those who were apparently guiding my destinies, we'll say my commercial destinies at the time, thought it would be a good thing to do.
And in many ways, of course, they were absolutely right.
We're about to start our 10th year.
Naturally, your wide variety of activities doesn't allow you time to direct any great number of television shows, but I presume you select and approve all the stories.
Oh, I'd definitely go into the stories very thoroughly with an indication as to how they should be treated and so forth. And then, of course, I go through the finished product.
And Miss Joan Harrison, of course, who's your associate in the making of the television series, has a pretty good idea of what you like and don't like anyway.
And Mr. Lloyd, who is also an associate, Norman Lloyd, producer, he's been with me a long time. And shall we say, they know what I'm talking about.
Hitch, a wonderful thing about a man with so definite a point of view and so definite a personality, at the same time, he is most respectful of other points of view within that orbit, so to speak. And consequently, he may make an observation about a film, but he certainly entertains a discussion about it, and at times says, well, if you really believe that, and we've had this happen, go ahead and do it.
Our particular kind of television film is not as easy to make as people would sometimes think, because it's not just a simple crime thing. It also has to be a study in character. And the kind of story that Hitch most likes to make, which is a story in which innocent people get involved in something terrible, very often which they themselves have not brought about, but which just happens to them, requires character building.
Yes.
As well as keeping the suspense going.
A Hitchcock film usually happens, the story is usually about very sort of normal people, seemingly, in rather usual circumstances. And the exterior of the situation is usually rather a sort of plain and steady world, you know, it isn't an extreme world. And into this, something very unusual begins to creep. And as it begins to happen in a most, almost simple sense, actually, Hitch, who has a wonderful eye, actually has the most simple use of the camera, but it's always has what we call camera logic. It's always always the right place. Into this world, danger begins to creep. And with it a kind of humor that this danger brings along with it. So that at times you're fairly certain that you're going to laugh, but then you're frightened. Or you're frightened or horror-struck, and then you laugh.
You must have a basic sense of humor about it, because that's what you're doing. You're doing it deliberately to scare people. And after all, there's no difference between my making Psycho to scare people, with tongue-in-cheek, shall we say, than a mother who says, boo to scare her 3-month-old baby. What's the difference?
I've never known any man who enjoys making films more than Hitch. It's just, it's so much part of him. It's the enjoyment of it is an example of how life should be. And I can't think of him doing anything else. I really can't imagine us doing anything else.
Hitch has always been very tactful about directors. I'm sure that many times he must have felt that he would rather like to direct a certain sequence all over again himself, but he's never said so. Just as much, as he'll never come on the stage, when one of the television directors is directing a show. He feels it's embarrassing for him, and he's perfectly right.
I have a strong impression that the real Alfred Hitchcock is not at all like the macabre and mischievous gentleman on the TV screen.
No, of course not.
You've said that you're a very shy person, Mr. Hitchcock, which is not at all the public's impression of you. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, I am shy, I'm not very gregarious. I don't mix with a lot of people. I don't think I'm very good in the company of a lot of men. Or, I don't know what it would be like among a lot of women. I don't know. But, no, we live a very quiet life, my wife and I. I come to the studio, I do my chores, and go home.
And what do you do for relaxation and diversion?
Make pictures.
You read a great deal, I would imagine?
Yes, but I don't read fiction. I read biographical material or historical or travel. But I don't never read fiction.
You've also done a great deal of travel yourself, you and Mrs. Hitchcock.
Oh, yes, we get around, yes, sure.
Tell me, if you were not a filmmaker by trade, whose films would you be likely to enjoy and admire as a moviegoer?
Well, I'm not a moviegoer, so I wouldn't know. Sorry to say.
Well, let me rephrase
I say that's a bad advertisement for our business. But let's say, who am I? I'm only one among so many.
Well, if you hadn't become a filmmaker, what would you like to have been?
I don't know, but I think with one's touch of hamminess, that degrading side of me, the actor, I think perhaps it might have been amusing to have been a criminal lawyer.
Mr. Hitchcock, what is your definition of happiness?
A clear horizon. Nothing to worry about on your plate. Only things that are creative and not destructive. I think that's within yourself. Within me, I can't bear quarreling. I can't bear feelings between people. I think hatred is wasted energy. And it's all non-productive. Some very sensitive. A sharp word said by, say, a person who has a temper, if they're close to me, hurts me for days. I know we're only human. We do go in for these various emotions, call them negative emotions. But when all these are removed and you can look forward and the road is clear ahead and now you're going to create something, I think that's as happy as I would ever want to be.
Telescope has been brought to you by General Motors of Canada, makers of Canada's most popular cars and trucks, and Frigidaire appliances.